the suffocating heat of a Spanish summer, within the cold stone walls of the El Escorial Palace, a once mighty king lay writhing in unimaginable torment. Philip II, the ruler of an empire so vast that the sun never set upon it, was being devoured not by enemies or beasts, but by his own decaying body, ravaged by disease and betrayal of the flesh. The air around him reeked of rot and despair, a stark contrast to the golden glory of his reign, as sores wept and fever burned through his frail frame. This was no noble end for a monarch who had shaped the destiny of Europe. It was a descent into a living hell, a death so horrific that even his closest courtiers could scarcely bear to witness it. Welcome to the tragic, gruesome final chapter of Spain's most powerful king, a story of power, faith, and a body turned against its master. To understand the depth of Philip II's suffering, we must first step back into the world that shaped him, a world of immense power, rigid faith, and unrelenting ambition. Born in 1527 in Valladolid, Philip was the son of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and Isabella of Portugal, inheriting a legacy that would make him one of the most influential rulers of the 16th century. His father's empire spanned much of Europe and the New World, and from a young age, Philip was groomed to uphold this colossal inheritance. He ascended to the Spanish throne in 1556 after Charles V abdicated, becoming the master of territories that included Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and vast colonial holdings in the Americas. His marriage to Mary I of England briefly tied him to the English crown, and though that union ended with her death in 1558, it cemented his image as a defender of Catholic Europe against the rising tide of Protestantism. Philip's reign was defined by his unyielding devotion to the Catholic Church and his determination to preserve its dominance. He saw himself as God's chosen instrument, a warrior against heresy, and his policies reflected this zeal. The Spanish Inquisition flourished under his rule, rooting out dissent with brutal efficiency, while his armies clashed with Protestant forces across Europe. His most famous military endeavor, the Spanish Armada of 1588, aimed to crush Protestant England under Elizabeth I, but its catastrophic failure marked a turning point, signaling the limits of his power. Yet, even as his empire faced challenges, Philip remained a figure of immense authority, ruling from the austere grandeur of El Escorial, the palace monastery he commissioned near Madrid. This sprawling complex, completed in 1584, was both a symbol of his piety and a fortress of control, a place where he micromanaged his empire with an iron grip, poring over endless documents late into the night. But beneath this facade of strength, Philip was a man burdened by personal and political strains. He married 4 times, each union marked by tragedy or political necessity, and outlived most of his children, a source of profound grief. His health, too, began to falter as he aged. Gout plagued him for years, rendering his joints swollen and painful, a cruel irony for a king who prided himself on discipline and restraint. By the 1590s, as he entered his late 60s, the weight of ruling an overstretched empire and the toll of personal losses began to show. He retreated more and more to El Escorial, seeking solace in prayer and the rigid routines of monastic life. Yet even there, he could not escape the creeping shadow of mortality. The man who had once commanded armies and shaped the fate of nations was now increasingly confined to his chambers, his body a battleground for ailments that no physician could conquer. The political landscape around Philip added to his burdens. Spain's economy, despite the influx of silver from the Americas, was strained by endless wars and mismanagement. The revolt in the Netherlands, ongoing since the 1560s, drained resources and defied resolution, while tensions with England and France persisted. At home, whispers of discontent grew louder. Some courtiers and nobles questioned his obsessive control, while others saw his religious fervor as a liability in a changing world. Philip, ever mistrustful, surrounded himself with loyal advisors but remained isolated, a king who bore the weight of his decisions alone. His faith, once a source of strength, became a lens through which he viewed his suffering, interpreting his physical decline as divine judgment or a test of endurance. As 1598 dawned, the stage was set for a final, harrowing chapter that would strip away the trappings of royalty and expose the raw, fragile humanity beneath. This was the world of Philip II, In his final years, a world of fading glory, where the might of an empire could not shield its ruler from the ravages of time and disease. His story is not just one of power, but of vulnerability, a reminder that even the greatest kings are mortal. As we move deeper into this tale, we will witness how the seeds of conflict, both within his body and his realm, grew into a storm of suffering that would consume him. The man who had once held the fate of millions in his hands would soon find himself at the mercy of forces beyond his control, forces that would lead to one of the most agonizing deaths in royal history. As the final years of the 16th century unfolded, the once unshakable edifice of Philip II's reign began to show ominous fissures. The king, now in his late 60s, sat at the heart of an empire stretched thin by ambition and conflict, his body and mind bearing the scars of decades of unrelenting responsibility. From the austere halls of El Escorial, he watched as external threats and internal dissent gnawed at the foundations of his power, while a more insidious enemy, his own failing health, tightened its grip. The man who had once been the scourge of heretics and the master of continents found himself increasingly besieged, not by armies, but by the creeping decay of his own flesh and the mounting discontent of his realm. This was the beginning of a downward spiral, a prelude to a death so horrific it would echo through history. Politically, Philip's empire was a colossus with feet of clay. The revolt in the Netherlands, sparked by religious and economic grievances, had raged for over 3 decades by the 1590s, defying every attempt at suppression. What began as a localized uprising had morphed into a quagmire, draining Spain's coffers and manpower with no end in sight. Philip's insistence on Catholic uniformity clashed with the Protestant leanings of the northern provinces, fueling a resistance led by figures like William of Orange, whose assassination in 1584 only hardened the resolve of the rebels. Each military campaign, each brutal reprisal, seemed to deepen the divide, and the cost of maintaining armies abroad weighed heavily on a treasury already strained by the fallout of the failed Spanish Armada. The defeat of 1588 against England lingered as a bitter wound, a public humiliation that emboldened Spain's enemies and sowed seeds of doubt among even Philip's most loyal subjects. France, too, under the newly crowned Henry IV, emerged as a renewed threat, with religious wars there complicating Philip's vision of a united Catholic Europe. At home, the atmosphere was no less tense. Spain's economy, once buoyed by the influx of silver and gold from the Americas, teetered on the brink of collapse. Inflation soared, eroding the wealth of the common people, while the crown's debts mounted to staggering levels. Philip's meticulous, almost obsessive control over governance, insisting on reviewing every detail, created bottlenecks, delaying decisions and frustrating his advisors. Whispers of discontent stirred among the nobility, some of whom chafed under his rigid policies and saw his religious zeal as a liability in a world increasingly shaped by pragmatic alliances rather than ideological crusades. Even within the royal court, factions vied for influence, sensing the king's growing frailty. Philip, ever paranoid, trusted few, retreating further into the solitude of El Escorial, where he surrounded himself with religious relics and the somber chants of monks, as if faith alone could shield him from the storm brewing around him. Yet, the most relentless conflict was not in the battlefield or the council chamber, but within Philip's own body. Gout, a torment he had endured for years, now struck with vicious regularity, rendering his hands and feet swollen and useless for days at a time. The pain was excruciating, a constant reminder of his mortality, and it confined him to his chambers more often than not. His physicians, bound by the limited medical knowledge of the era, could offer little beyond poultices and prayers, their treatments often doing more harm than good. Compounding this, Philip suffered from recurring fevers and digestive ailments, likely exacerbated by a diet heavy in meat and wine, common among the elite but disastrous for an aging body. His once sharp mind, though still formidable, began to falter under the strain of chronic pain and sleeplessness, and courtiers noted a growing irritability, a sharpness in his temper that betrayed the toll of his condition. The king, who had once ridden into battle and presided over grand ceremonies, was now a shadow of himself, his physical decline mirroring the cracks in his empire. This convergence of political and personal crises created a palpable sense of dread. Philip, a man of deep faith, interpreted his suffering through a spiritual lens, seeing it as a divine test or even punishment for the sins of his reign. He doubled down on his piety, spending hours in prayer and confession, seeking absolution for decisions that had cost countless lives, whether in the Inquisition's dungeons or on distant battlefields. Yet, no amount of devotion could halt the deterioration of his health or the erosion of his authority. Reports from the Netherlands grew grimmer, with entire regions slipping from Spanish control, while economic hardship at home fueled unrest among the peasantry. In the privacy of El Escorial, Philip's isolation deepened. He confided in few, perhaps sensing that even his closest allies could not shield him from the inevitable. The weight of an empire, once a source of pride, now pressed down on him like a millstone, each ache in his joints and each feverish night a harbinger of a darker fate. As 1598 approached, the storm clouds over Philip II's reign grew ever more ominous. The conflicts that had simmered for years, both within his realm and within his body, were reaching a boiling point, setting the stage for a collapse that would be as dramatic as it was tragic. The king, once the arbiter of Europe's destiny, was now a prisoner of his own failing flesh, his empire a reflection of his own fragility. What lay ahead was not just a decline, but a descent into a nightmare of suffering, a torment that would strip away the last vestiges of royal dignity and expose the raw, brutal reality of human frailty. By the spring of 1598, the once mighty Philip II, King of Spain and ruler of a global empire, was a man imprisoned not by chains or enemies, but by the relentless betrayal of his own body. Confined to the stark, echoing chambers of El Escorial, his world had shrunk from the vast horizons of continents to the narrow confines of a sickbed, where every breath was a battle and every movement a torment. The king who had once dictated the fate of nations now lay at the mercy of ailments that no crown, no army, and no prayer could vanquish. His decline, already marked by years of gout and fevers, had taken a sinister turn, transforming into a cascade of suffering that stripped away his strength and dignity with cruel precision. This was no mere illness. It was a siege upon his very being, a prelude to an end that would horrify even the most hardened of his courtiers. The gout that had plagued Philip for decades had become a constant, vicious companion, its attacks growing more frequent and severe. His joints, particularly in his hands and feet, swelled to grotesque proportions, the skin stretched tight and inflamed, rendering him unable to walk or even grasp a quill without excruciating pain. The simplest task, signing a decree, holding a rosary, became Herculean efforts, and he often relied on secretaries to manage the endless paperwork that defined his rule. But gout was only the beginning of his ordeal. A series of fevers, likely tied to infections or underlying conditions unknown to the rudimentary medicine of the time, racked his body with alarming regularity. These bouts left him drenched in sweat, shivering uncontrollably even in the stifling heat of a Spanish summer, his once robust frame reduced to a gaunt, trembling shell. His physicians, adhering to the prevailing theories of humoral imbalance, prescribed bleedings and purgatives, treatments that only weakened him further, draining what little vitality remained. Worse still were the sores and abscesses that began to appear on his body, a grim manifestation of his deteriorating condition. These wounds, possibly exacerbated by poor circulation from gout or secondary infections, refused to heal, weeping pus and emitting a foul odor that permeated his chambers, despite the efforts of attendants to mask it with incense. One particularly severe abscess on his knee grew so large and painful that it immobilized him completely, confining him to his bed for weeks at a time. The king, a man of meticulous personal discipline, was humiliated by his inability to control his own body, forced to endure the indignity of being tended to like an infant. His linens changed frequently to manage the discharge from his wounds. The air in his room grew heavy with the stench of decay, a constant reminder of the rot setting in not just in his flesh, but in the very essence of his reign. Even his faith, the bedrock of his life, offered little solace. He prayed incessantly, yet the silence of God seemed to mock his suffering. Philip's mental state, too, began to fray under the weight of his physical torment. The sharp, calculating mind that had once outmaneuvered rivals and orchestrated vast campaigns grew clouded by pain and exhaustion. Sleepless nights, punctuated by fits of delirium during high fevers, left him disoriented, sometimes unable to distinguish between reality and the fevered visions that haunted him. He spoke often of divine judgment, confiding to his confessors that his agonies might be penance for the blood spilled under his rule, whether through the Inquisition or the wars that bore his name. Yet, even in his moments of clarity, he clung to his duties, insisting on reviewing state papers from his bed, his trembling hand guided by sheer willpower. This stubborn resolve, while admirable, only deepened his exhaustion, as if he believed that relinquishing control would hasten his end. His courtiers, torn between pity and fear, watched as the king's obsession with governance became a form of self-torture, each labored breath a testament to a spirit refusing to yield even as the body crumbled. The atmosphere at El Escorial mirrored the king's decline, a somber pall settling over the palace monastery. Attendants and nobles moved in hushed tones, their faces etched with unease, as they bore witness to a ruler unraveling. Rumors of Philip's condition spread beyond the palace walls, carried by whispers to the streets of Madrid and the courts of Europe, where enemies and allies alike speculated on the future of Spain. Within the royal household, tension simmered. Some advisors urged the king to delegate more authority to his heir, Philip III, while others feared the power vacuum that might follow his death. The king himself, sensing the fragility of his grip on power, grew ever more mistrustful, his isolation deepening as he retreated into a world of pain and prayer. The once grand monarch, a symbol of Catholic might, was now a figure of tragic vulnerability, his body a battlefield where no victory was possible. As the months of 1598 wore on, Philip II's condition showed no sign of reprieve, each day bringing new torments that hinted at an even grimmer fate. The sores multiplied, the fevers intensified, and the pain became a relentless drumbeat, drowning out all else. This was not just a decline, but a descent into a living nightmare, a slow unraveling of a man who had once held the world in his hands. What lay ahead would test the limits of human endurance, pushing Philip beyond the brink of suffering into a realm of horror that would define his final days. In the sweltering summer of 1598, within the cavernous solitude of El Escorial, Philip II, King of Spain, entered the darkest chapter of his long and storied life. What had begun as a slow decline now accelerated into a grotesque symphony of suffering, his body a prison of unrelenting agony that no royal title could unlock. The once formidable monarch, whose decrees had shaped the destiny of empires, lay trapped in a bed of torment, his flesh rotting while he yet lived, his every gasp a plea for a mercy that refused to come. This was no longer merely illness. It was a living death, a descent into a hell on earth where the boundaries of endurance were shattered. As July bled into August, Philip's final battle was not against foreign foes or heretics, but against the horrifying decay that devoured him from within. The sores and abscesses that had marred his body for months now multiplied with terrifying speed, transforming his skin into a map of misery. These open wounds, particularly severe on his legs and torso, festered with infection, oozing pus and blood that stained the linens beneath him despite the constant efforts of his attendants to keep them clean. The stench of decay was overpowering, a miasma that clung to the air of his chamber, seeping into the very stone of El Escorial and driving away all but the most devoted or obligated of his court. His physicians, helpless against the tide of infection in an era before antibiotics, resorted to crude interventions, lancing the abscesses in desperate bids to drain the corruption. Each cut of the knife was a fresh torment, eliciting groans from the king that echoed through the palace, a sound so raw and pitiful that even hardened soldiers among his guard turned away in discomfort. The pain was ceaseless, a burning, throbbing agony that no opiate or prayer could dull, leaving Philip to endure a waking nightmare where sleep was a fleeting, tortured escape. Compounding this horror was the onset of dropsy, a condition marked by severe swelling as fluid accumulated in his body, likely a result of failing organs and poor circulation. His abdomen bloated grotesquely, pressing against his already weakened frame, making every breath a labored struggle. His legs, once merely crippled by gout, now swelled to monstrous proportions, the skin stretched so taut it seemed ready to split, adding a new layer of torment to his already unbearable existence. This swelling trapped him in absolute immobility. He could not turn, could not sit, could only lie in a fixed position as his body became a tomb of flesh, entombing him alive. Attendants, under strict orders to maintain the king's dignity, struggled to reposition him to prevent bed sores, but each movement drew cries of anguish, his voice once commanding armies reduced to a frail, broken whimper. The indignity of his condition gnawed at Philip as much as the physical pain, a man of such pride and control now utterly at the mercy of others, his royal bearing stripped away by the brutal reality of human frailty. His mental state, already frayed by months of suffering, now teetered on the edge of collapse. Fevers raged with renewed ferocity, plunging him into bouts of delirium, where he muttered incoherently, sometimes calling out to long-dead loved ones or confessing sins to invisible priests. In lucid moments, his faith remained his anchor, and he insisted on hearing Mass daily from his bed, clutching a crucifix with trembling, swollen fingers, as if it could shield him from the horrors of his condition. He spoke often of resignation, telling his confessor, Fray Diego de Yepes, that he welcomed death as a release. Yet the fear of divine judgment haunted him. Had he done enough to secure his soul? His obsession with spiritual preparation grew, even as his body failed. He ordered his coffin to be brought into his chamber, a stark wooden box placed where he could see it, a constant reminder of the end he both dreaded and desired. This macabre act unnerved his attendants, who saw in it not just acceptance, but a king already half buried, lingering in a purgatory of his own making. The palace of El Escorial, meant to be a monument to divine order and royal power, became a mausoleum for the living. The monks' chants, once a source of solace, now sounded like dirges, their somber tones weaving through the corridors as if mourning a king not yet gone. Courtiers and advisors, torn between duty and revulsion, kept their visits brief, their faces pale as they emerged from the king's chamber, the weight of his suffering etched into their expressions. News of Philip's condition spread beyond Spain, carried by diplomats and spies to the courts of Europe, where speculation about his successor and the future of the empire intensified. Within the palace, the air was thick with dread, every creak of the building and every moan from the king's room, a reminder of the inevitable. Philip II, the man who had once held the world in his grasp, was now a prisoner of his own decaying shell, each passing day drawing him closer to a climax of suffering that would sear itself into history. As August waned, Philip's condition reached a point of no return, the horrors of his body's betrayal setting the stage for a final, unbearable reckoning. The king, suspended between life and death, faced torments that defied comprehension, his once mighty form reduced to a vessel of pure agony. What awaited in the coming days would not just end his reign, but would do so in a manner so ghastly that it would linger as a testament to the fragility of even the greatest of men. As September 1598 dawned over the austere fortress of El Escorial, Philip II, King of Spain, hovered on the precipice of eternity, his body a ravaged battlefield where life and death waged their final, brutal skirmish. For weeks, he had endured a living hell, his flesh consumed by festering sores, his frame swollen with dropsy, and his spirit battered by unrelenting pain. Now, in the twilight of his reign, the end approached with a ferocity that defied all notions of a dignified royal passing. This was no gentle fading of a monarch into history. It was a gruesome, agonizing, unraveling, a death so horrific that it would haunt those who witnessed it and echo through the annals of time as a testament to human suffering. On the 13th of September, 1598, the ruler of the world's greatest empire would breathe his last, but not before enduring a climax of torment that stripped away the final vestiges of his earthly power. In the days leading to his death, Philip's condition deteriorated to a state beyond comprehension. The abscesses that had plagued him for months now covered much of his body, their infection spreading unchecked, turning his skin into a patchwork of raw, weeping wounds. The stench of decay was so overpowering that even the heavy incense burned by the monks could not mask it, permeating the palace and sickening those who dared to enter his chamber. His abdomen, bloated with fluid from dropsy, pressed against his lungs, making each breath a shallow, desperate gasp, as if he were drowning in his own body. The swelling in his legs and arms had reached a grotesque peak, rendering him utterly immobile, a prisoner in a bed that had become his torture rack. His physicians, powerless against the tide of infection and organ failure, abandoned their futile treatments, admitting in hushed tones that only a miracle or death could release their king. Attendants, bound by duty, wiped the pus and blood from his wounds, their hands trembling as they performed acts of care that felt more like desecration, each touch drawing faint moans from a man too weak to scream. The pain, a constant companion for so long, now reached an unbearable crescendo. It was not just the physical agony of rotting flesh and failing organs, but the sheer exhaustion of enduring such torment for weeks without respite. Philip's once keen mind, though clouded by fever and delirium, clung to fragments of awareness, enough to comprehend the horror of his state. In rare moments of lucidity, he whispered prayers, his cracked lips moving with the fervor of a man desperate for salvation, clutching a crucifix so tightly that his swollen fingers bled. He had long since ordered his coffin to be placed beside his bed, a grim sentinel that he gazed upon with a mixture of dread and longing, as if willing it to claim him. To his confessor, Fray Diego de Yepes, he expressed a resigned acceptance, murmuring that he had lived long enough and was ready to meet his Maker, yet the fear of divine judgment lingered in his eyeshad. His reign, marked by bloodshed and zeal, earned him heaven or hell. This spiritual anguish, layered atop his physical suffering, was a final, cruel twist, a torment of the soul to match the devastation of the body. On the night of the 12th of September, as a storm brewed outside El Escorial, casting eerie shadows through the palace windows, Philip's suffering reached its peak. A high fever gripped him, plunging him into a delirium so profound that he no longer recognized the faces around him, muttering incoherently about battles long past and loved ones long gone. His breathing grew erratic, each inhalation a ragged, wet rasp, signaling the collapse of his lungs under the weight of fluid and infection. His son, Philip III, and daughter, Isabella Clara Eugenia, stood by his bedside, their faces etched with grief and horror as they watched their father, once a titan of power, reduced to a broken, dying man. The monks chanted ceaselessly, their voices a somber backdrop to the king's final hours, while candles flickered, casting a dim, ghostly light over a scene that seemed more akin to a medieval depiction of damnation than a royal deathbed. At one point, Philip's eyes opened briefly, wide with a fleeting clarity, and he whispered a final request for absolution, his voice barely audible over the storm's howl. It was a moment of heartbreaking vulnerability, the last act of a king whose life had been defined by control, now surrendering to forces beyond his grasp. In the early hours of the 13th of September, 1598, after a night of unrelenting agony, Philip II's struggle finally ceased. His breathing slowed, then stopped, his chest rising no more, as death claimed him at last, a release from a torment that had stretched the limits of human endurance. The room fell silent, save for the distant rumble of thunder, as those present realized the Colossus of Spain was gone. His body, a grotesque shell of what it had once been, lay still, the sores and swelling a stark testament to the brutality of his final weeks. There was no grandeur in this passing, no triumphant farewell for a ruler who had shaped an era. There was only the raw, ugly truth of mortality, a death so ghastly that even the hardened courtiers wept, not just for their king, but for the sheer horror of what they had witnessed. Philip II, the man who had ruled an empire where the sun never set, had been devoured alive by disease. His end, a chilling reminder that even the mightiest are not spared the ravages of the flesh. In the pre-dawn stillness of the 13th of September, 1598, as the storm that had raged over El Escorial subsided, the heart of Spain's mighty empire fell silent with the passing of King Philip II. The chamber where he had endured his final horrific torments was now a somber shrine to a ruler's end, the air still heavy with the scent of decay and incense, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows over a body that had once commanded the world. His death, a gruesome ordeal of festering wounds and unrelenting pain, marked not just the close of a reign, but the end of an era of unparalleled power, rigid faith, and profound human frailty. Yet, as the news of his passing spread from the stone walls of the palace to the farthest reaches of his empire, the story of Philip II did not end with his last breath. It lingered in the aftermath, in the shifting tides of power, and in the way history would remember or struggle to remember a king whose life and death were as monumental as they were tragic. The immediate aftermath of Philip's death was a moment of both mourning and uncertainty within Spain and beyond. At El Escorial, the monks who had chanted through his final hours now prepared his body for burial, a task made harrowing by the state of his ravaged flesh. Following his explicit wishes, he was laid to rest in the crypt beneath the palace's basilica, a place he had designed as a final resting ground for himself and his dynasty, surrounded by the relics and religious iconography that had defined his life. His funeral was a solemn affair, attended by nobles and clergy, though many could not shake the memory of his agonizing decline, their grief tinged with a visceral unease. His son, Philip III, ascended to the throne at the age of 20, inheriting an empire burdened by debt, ongoing wars, and internal strife. Unlike his father, the new king lacked the iron will and obsessive control that had characterized Philip II's rule. He delegated much to advisors like the Duke of Lerma, signaling a shift toward a less centralized, more faction-driven court. For many in Spain, the transition was a quiet relief after the intensity of Philip II's reign, yet it also sowed seeds of concern. Could a young, untested monarch hold together an empire already showing signs of strain? Across Europe, the news of Philip's death rippled through courts with a mix of trepidation and opportunism. In the Netherlands, where rebellion against Spanish rule had raged for decades, leaders of the Protestant resistance saw an opening, hoping the new king's inexperience would weaken Spain's grip. In England, Elizabeth I. Philip's old adversary received the tidings with a complex blend of satisfaction and wariness, knowing that while her greatest foe was gone, Spain remained a formidable power. France, under Henry IV, moved to exploit the transition, seeking to renegotiate tensions that had simmered under Philip II's aggressive Catholic policies. The Peace of Vervins, signed just months before Philip's death in May 1598, had already ended hostilities between Spain and France, but the king's passing cemented a fragile détente, shifting the balance of power in Europe. Back in Spain, economic woes persisted, the influx of American silver unable to offset the staggering debts incurred by Philip's wars and ambitions. The people, weary from taxation and hardship, mourned their king with a muted reverence, many more preoccupied with survival than with the grandeur of his legacy. Philip II's legacy, however, was far from muted. It was a towering, often polarizing force that shaped the course of history. He left behind an empire that, at its peak, spanned continents, a testament to his vision of a unified Catholic world. His reign saw the zenith of Spanish power, with the colonization of the Americas bringing immense wealth and the Spanish Inquisition enforcing religious conformity with ruthless efficiency. Yet, his failures were as significant as his triumphs. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 marked a symbolic turning point, signaling the limits of Spanish dominance, while the ongoing revolt in the Netherlands drained resources and defied resolution. His obsessive micromanagement and unyielding faith often blinded him to pragmatic solutions, alienating allies and fueling dissent. Historians would later debate his impact. Some saw him as a defender of tradition in a fracturing world, others as a tyrant whose zeal sowed division. In Spain, he became a figure of myth, the austere king of El Escorial, a symbol of both imperial glory and the personal cost of absolute power. Perhaps the most enduring, if grim, aspect of his legacy was the story of his death itself. The horrific nature of his final weeks devoured alive by disease. His body, a canvas of suffering, became a whispered legend, a cautionary tale of mortality that transcended his political achievements. It was a reminder that even the mightiest rulers are subject to the frailties of the flesh, their crowns powerless against the ravages of time and illness. In the centuries that followed, accounts of his agony were recorded by chroniclers and retold with a mix of fascination and horror, a stark contrast to the sanitized narratives often crafted for royalty. This brutal honesty ensured that Philip II was remembered not just as a king, but as a man, whose end was as human as it was harrowing. As we reflect on the life and death of Philip II, a question lingers like a shadow over El Escorial's cold stone walls. What does it mean to wield power when the body itself can become the ultimate betrayer? His story is not just a chapter in history, but a mirror held up to our own vulnerabilities. a reminder of the thin line between dominion and despair. If this tale of triumph and torment has stirred something in you, share your thoughts. Do you see Philip II as a titan of his time or a tragic figure undone by his own zeal? Let us keep this conversation alive, for in remembering the past, we uncover truths about ourselves.